Well, hey there, my honeydews. Today we're going to kick off a new series where I compare and contrast different character design techniques. Our topic today is mind mapping, or I suppose a modified version of it, which I'll explain better throughout the course of the video. Since this is the first episode, I will focus on the strengths and weaknesses of mind mapping without the comparison to techniques that I honestly don't have much experience with yet. Also, sorry if I sound different or unclear. I'm not sick today, but I did literally just get snake bite piercings done. I've decided to play the time lapses in chronological order for the sake of simplicity, and that places Mello as the first. Luckily, Mello's time lapse is also the longest, which makes it the perfect candidate for explaining this method. I have been calling it mind mapping, which you likely saw in the title and heard in the intro. I first saw it as an exercise for essay writing, where you write down key concepts you want to hit, then branches that are subtopics of those concepts. I haven't seen it used for design before, and I modified it to be more of a web. I still start by jotting down my main concepts, then I link anything I think of related to those topics. And I mean anything. I just free associate until I have a pretty good idea of what I want to do for the design. The main draw of this method is that it really points you into a direction. And I also generally like writing down ideas even if I know I don't like them. Once they're written down, my brain stops feeling the need to repeat the idea over and over again. I get to actually move forward with brainstorming. I actually made Mello's mind map in a physical journal because I hadn't quite solidified all the ideas and concepts of this series yet. In fact, I'm not even sure I had the idea to make this into a series yet. So since it's on paper, I don't have a time lapse of me writing down everything, but I can show you the picture and hit some highlights. I do think that you should probably do this process on paper if possible, or at least not limit your canvas and be paying attention to readability for the sake of a YouTube video. Because I'm seeing here that Mello's map is a lot more expansive than the others you'll see later on. This drawing is quite old actually. I knew that I made it for Art Fight, but assumed that I made it this past June. I discovered while digging up the photo of the map that I, in fact, made this in June of 2024. I saved the footage, assuming I would use it for something eventually, and right now is eventually, I suppose. You'll notice as we go along that, for that reason, this one doesn't fit how I currently make my reference sheets. I should let you know before we start discussing the effectiveness of the design technique for Mello that Mello has been around for a very long time. As indicated during my OC-tober challenge, they are my oldest OC that I can recall. Therefore, this is not their first design. For the sake of clarity, we should consider this as a test of how good mind mapping is for redesigns, and not for coming up with new characters. I think I still have some pretty valuable things to say regardless, but if you'd like, you can skip ahead to the next character who is fully from scratch. Mello has been an especially strong presence in my mind since late 2019, when I got bored during study hall and began to write a story that I now refer to as Roamers. They were one of the main characters, along with my OC Max, who doesn't currently have a canon design. Despite this presence, every time I tried to draw Mello, it just never worked. Long before Roamers, when they were just a doodled magical girl, their outfit was very feminine, a trait typical of magical girls, of course. I knew each time I designed them that I wasn't satisfied, but I wasn't really sure why. I always kept the feminine traits because that's how they had always been. Originally, they were just a cisgender girl. One of my original desires for Roamers was actually for a strong male-female bond to form between the main characters without them ending up together romantically. Then, shortly after I came out as transgender, I had a desire to write a story that mattered, something that would have been powerful to my younger self. So I threw out that draft and started over, a version focusing on Mello and their slow revelation of their gender identity. This version of the story gave me a lot of valuable information about Mello, but I wasn't able to put the action and fantasy and gender ideas together in a cohesive way. I imagine this was mostly a limitation of my writing ability at the time, and not that these themes are impossible to put together. Regardless, that version ended up scrapped as well. I spent quite a while thinking about what had gone wrong previously. One of the weakest points of Mello's story for a long time had been how they had become a pirate. One day, the weak parts of their piratehood and the unsatisfying elements of their gender identity collided. The answer was pretty clear. They had known for quite some time that they didn't fit into the role of woman that they were supposed to, and that fact was a large part of why they became a pirate. There is a little bit more to the story, but you'll just have to wait for Roamers to come out in 20 years at this rate. Something else that had escaped me for a while was drawing Mello in a way that that matched their environment. While clinging to their fantastical and feminine elements that I was attached to, I ignored how impractical those things would be for a pirate in a tropical zone. They had a short skirt for a long time, without even leggings underneath. I also spent a lot of effort writing excuses for why they had modern clothes in a non-modern setting, when I probably should have just taken the modern clothes away. Writing out environmental factors as a core part of the design process made me actually think about how to visually show what sort of life Mello lives. As mentioned, I did this almost 2 years ago now, so don't remember the details perfectly, but as far as I can tell, based on the photo and just what makes sense for me to have done, I started with 4 base concepts: catgirl, nobility, utility, and climbing. I'm noticing now that I somehow never wrote pirate as the topic itself, which I guess is because I knew so strongly that Milo was a pirate, or I just forgot. Just a note, I write nobility as shorthand for born into such immense wealth that their family basically owns the town. The island that Mello was born on is called Koskelo, and is a human colony of a specific kingdom I haven't named yet. But the point is that there aren't human nobles on Koskelo, so Mello and their family are about as close as you'll get. This doesn't really come across visually, but that was also kind of the point. They were raised in a stuck-up, rich as hell family, but left that behind to become a pirate. I did give them a little locket from their family, but they don't even wear it. Just keep it in their bag. And just to point out a little thing I did that I think is pretty cool, both the pendant and their engagement ring are silver, while all the jewelry that they've gotten for themselves is gold. It really shows that their engagement ring and pendant, but again they don't actually wear it, isn't a part of the rest of their life. For utility, I believe I wrote it down not with the intention of making their design very practical, but just to combat just how impractical their design used to be. I mean, seriously, a short skirt for a character who frequently climbs trees, and that's just the worst of it. But I don't need to spend all video ragging on Mello's old designs. While we unfortunately didn't watch the mind mapping this time, I do need to say that my very first observation about the method is that this is my favorite design. It is everything I wanted Mello to be. They are an androgynous jungle pirate cat girl, and you can tell just from the reference sheet. The method really helped me to connect ideas I had had about Mello's character to their visual design, instead of just drawing what I thought would look cool and just telling people that they're a pirate, just telling people that they're from a jungle, just telling people that they're very practical. They have always had those traits, and I feel like none of them are featured visually in any of their past designs. I also feel like it's pretty clear that it's not only my opinion that this design was my best, because Mello was by far my most attacked character during both art fights they've participated in. I've had a renewed love for Mello since making this reference sheet, when previously they had lived in the background. Let's not put too much stock into a character I've been cooking up for 6 years though, and move on to one I first designed for this video. Luckily for the video, this time I made the mind map within Krita and recorded it. I didn't go too crazy on this one because I knew that I wanted a relatively simple design for Warhook. She was mentioned incredibly briefly in a roleplay, and that has been her only appearance so far, so not a lot of thought had gone into her or her design until working on the drawing shown here. She didn't even appear in the roleplay, so I had to figure out her character traits and personality as well as her visual design. Warhook is part of a for-fun fantasy world I'm working on called Nidio Viva. It didn't have a name at the time, but my video where I finished Drawfee's Color Palette Challenge showcases characters that are part of Nidio Vivas as well. In fact, everyone in this video except for Mello is from Nidio Vivas. That wasn't planned like it was for the color palettes, I guess. There's just a lot of characters I want to design for Nidio Vivas, so when I randomly select a character that needs a design from my backlog, it's frequently going to be from there. Back to talking about Warhook. Like I mentioned, I didn't know all that much about her when starting this design. I pretty much knew 3-ish things. She invented nets, and therefore became the goddess of nets within the Chests of Blaze pantheon. She's the demigod daughter of Blast, the god of hunting, and a human man, and she is, in some manner, emotionally connected to her parents. It wasn't a lot, but definitely was enough, especially using the mind mapping method. After I made the map, I took a screenshot and used it for reference throughout the process. While I'm talking about it, I'll keep it on screen for you as well, hopefully someplace that doesn't block the drawing. I recognized while writing this script and trying to explain my process to an audience that a lot of this process happened subconsciously. I wrote down a lot of ideas and a lot of topics related to those ideas, but I didn't really write what those ideas meant visually, and sometimes I jumped to a new concept just in my head. For example, I wrote down the word God, since she is one, but what I didn't write down is that it meant that laws of physics and practicality are secondary considerations. She isn't bound to those things. On a related note, I did keep her design relatively practical because I associate survival rival another mapped concept with practicality. Something that got entirely left out of the map was the fact that she was an inventor, and I personally also associate inventiveness with practicality, especially for incredibly practical inventions such as the net. I also notably make her look youthful, because I subconsciously associated her godhood with youthfulness and immortality. I wrote quiet on the map as a connecting idea between humble and hunt, and because of that, I avoided anything that would be noisy as she moved, but also avoided too much visual noise in her design. And you'll see when I draw her expressions, I also took the opportunity to contrast this quietness with a loud personality. This was pretty good for me too, because I'm pretty sure that none of my OCs so far had a similar personality. Like many artists and writers, I put a lot of myself into my characters, and I think writing this script is a bit of a wake-up call to how frequently I make my OCs pretty quiet. It might be hard to believe now that we're 11 or so minutes into this video, but in real life, I frequently am unable and or unwilling to speak. Or maybe it's not that hard to believe. I've been told that my voiceovers are easy and calming to listen to, and I feel like that's related to my real life quietness. I mentioned earlier that I'm transgender, though I think it might have been obvious if I didn't say it out loud. I feel the tiniest bit embarrassed to bring it up again so soon, but being transgender impacts my art and writing a lot. I have a lot of sapphic friends who mostly draw sapphic women. I know other trans artists who mostly draw trans characters. The truth is that people write and draw what they're familiar with or what they want. I'm bringing this up now because one of the reasons I'm so proud of Warhook is because she's not trans. She is just a cisgender woman, or as cisgender as a shape-shifting god can get. And even more than writing and drawing her that way, I'm happy with her as a cis woman. I mentioned during Mellow's segment that they were once a girl and got morphed into a trans-masked person over time. This has happened more than with just Mellow, and some of the few women who have stayed women got turned into trans women. I don't think it's bad if I or anyone else write fiction characters that are just for our own fun and comfort and escapism, but I do want to be a better and more capable artist and writer. If you're more on the art side, you'll probably recognize this idea, even if it's not specifically about views about gender. There's nothing wrong with only drawing cute anime girl headshots if all you want to draw is cute anime girl headshots. But if you want to get better and draw other things, you have to actually draw the other things. I can't write an entire fantasy world like I'm trying to do with Nidio Vivis just by writing trans people. Well, I suppose I could if I did it on purpose, with part of the intent of the world being that it's full of trans people. But that's not the intent of Nidio Vivis, so I'm expanding. As you have possibly noticed if you've been following the channel, Warhook actually got one of my cool new reference sheets I started using when I designed my Sona. I think she is the second one to get this glamorous new treatment, and it totally solidified the idea in my head of using this template. I love how it's a guide for what I should put on a reference sheet, and I love how I can look at it and recognize it as my reference sheet. Obviously, I always knew because I drew them. I guess I mean in a branding sense, seeing all of my characters together in the same manner. Anyway, I just love how this turned out. It makes me really excited to make use of Warhook in the future. So Roman is another character of mine that's been around a while, though not quite as long as Mellow if I'm remembering right. There is something fundamentally different about his design/redesign from Mellow's though. Roman has never really had a story attached to him. It is a little weird to have a character close to your heart without having so much as a backstory, much less thoughts about their current life. When I was young, in fact, too young according to the terms of services of probably all of the websites involved, I was really into Undertale. I mean, I still like Undertale now and think it's an incredible display of storytelling and all of that, but I used to eat, breathe, and sleep Undertale fan content. All of my friends at this time were, in some manner, gained through a shared love of Undertale. This was mostly happening through DeviantArt, and something about those two things meant that all of my new friends were really into role-playing, especially Undertale-flavored role-playing, of course. So I made myself an Undertale OC, Ariel. She did have a story that built up over time, but mostly she was just a girl skeleton wearing a shirt that I owned at the time. So like Ariel was intended for, I roleplayed with her. It started with being pretty baked into the story of Undertale, but definitely drifted further and further over time. Ariel began to appear more frequently as a human than as a skeleton. I definitely have a more complex understanding of gender now, but back then, to me the gender of a skeleton basically didn't matter. But with Ariel appearing as a human, her gender did matter. Like I said, I think this position is more than a little silly now, but it's an important part of Roman's history. Because the reason that Roman exists at all is that one day I wanted a guy character for role-playing, and my friend joked that the male version of Ariel, named named after the font, would be called Times New Roman. That's right, Roman began as a gender-swap version of an Undertale OC for roleplaying. Roman became my go-to when I needed a guy to roleplay as, but especially if they had to be mean or rude. I already had a guy full of kindness to roleplay as, my OC Max that I mentioned during Mello's segment. I kind of liked Max more than Roman, so if I could play as Max, then I did. So Roman slowly became more and more rude and self-centered as a character, which also started to separate him more from Ariel. I also think that alternate dimension gender-swapped characters are usually going to be different just because of how they're socialized differently. I didn't magically stop letting men interrupt me when I came out as trans, and 5 years later, I still haven't quite figured that out, honestly. I also think I'm more likely to put a disclaimer like that explaining my position than the average person socialized as male. The point is, though, that Roman became a floater OC. He had no project, no story idea, no background to call his own, and everything about him was so far removed from Undertale. He was very close to my heart, but I only knew a few things about him. I knew he was a jerk, and I knew that his favorite color was purple. Nidio Vivus is a project I've been thinking about the most recently, and like I mentioned, these are going in chronological order. I had just finished my Warhook design when I started on Romans. I wasn't quite sure how he'd fit into it, but at least it was a direction to start heading in. I feel like I mention this in every video at this point, but I have a job. Sometimes I'm a housekeeper, and when I am, I like to listen to music while I'm cleaning. I got stuck in the middle of trying to make the mind map for Roman, and went to work with just a few words on the page, and no real direction in mind for him. I was idly thinking about working on Roman when I got home from work, when Viva La Vida came on, the song you probably know from Coldplay, though I happened to be listening to a cover by Ranieri. In case you haven't heard the song, or didn't listen too closely to the lyrics, it's about a king or ruler being overthrown by his own citizens. As I'll discuss later, I did toss the part about the citizens during the overthrowing, but I immediately latched onto the general concept for Roman, and spent a good portion of that shift thinking about Roman. After all, I also associate jerks and the color purple with royalty. It kinda fits. I went home after work and finished the map immediately. I even wrote Viva La Vida right on the map. I wrote the related concepts as well, confirming that Roman would be dethroned royalty. There was a small bump in the plan though, a little itch that wouldn't go away. A big part of my vision for Nidio Vivus was that there wouldn't be a lot of humans. Now I haven't completed the visual design for him yet, but I have another human character planned named Avrul. He's already a human prince. I thought about just somehow making Avrul and Roman brothers, but I just didn't like it. It didn't fit quite right, especially since I spent hours writing a naming language for Avrul and his culture, and the name Roman doesn't follow those rules. 2 human princes meant 2 human kingdoms, which was too many humans for my vision. I also thought that Avrul would be from the last human kingdom. Finally, I did land on a solution. Roman would be from a different kingdom, but he lost the throne, not by a revolution of his citizens, but from an outside force. Beasts, which you can think of as orc stand-ins for the sake of this video, conquered Roman's kingdom while he was a young prince and he fled. I added hiding and foreign to the mind map to reflect this, and made sure to give him different features than what I planned for Avrul. I did a bit of research about some different traits, and thought about doing speculative evolution on these humans in their regions, but I did end up pulling from the real world. Roman is from a more northern kingdom, so has pale skin and red hair. Since this is a video about designs, let me talk about how I feel about Romans. First, it's very different from what I'm used to. I actually only drew Roman once before this, but that design is stuck in my head for the few years since then. The part I struggle most with is that his new design is a lot more androgynous, when Roman has always been a very masculine figure in my mind. I think logically it's pretty good actually. I think him appearing less masculine lends to his need to assert his masculinity with his actions. I also like that it makes him appear dainty and delicate, as that works well with him being a spoiled royal. I think these are probably good design decisions, but it's hard to get over the dissonance in my head. I do think that his design could be stronger. His identity doesn't come across well visually, which might be a good thing. He is meant to be in hiding, I suppose. That explains why you can't tell he's a prince unless you know about some specific Nidio Vivus lore, royalty having face tattoos related to a specific courting procedure, which you can see on Roman's cheek in the parts that shows his face, but you can't really tell anything about him. You can't tell that he's a jerk, that he's pretentious, that he's scared out of his mind and has no clue what he's doing. Many of the visual changes were essential to the new story, but I still can't help but be bothered by all of the differences. New Roman just doesn't look like the Roman I thought of for so long. I don't think what I've created size so far is untrue, but I also think I'm biased against it just because it's not what I'm used to. Another thing not related to the design itself is that the drawing itself is weak in some areas, which makes me like to design less, even though I could draw it better. The best example is the clips in the hair. They're meant to be little silver cylindrical beads that have been crimped into place. I didn't draw that very well, and I'm very confident I didn't because my friend asked what they were supposed to be. I just spent a lot of time trashing on the design, but to be honest, it's still a lot better than the previous design. It's not perfect, and I wouldn't be very surprised if I do a redo someday, but what's on your screen now has way more thought and care put into it than how I previously drew him. I don't know, feel free to tell me your own thoughts about him. I've spent way too long talking about him already. Iris has a little bit of history, but not anywhere close to the amount that Mello and Roman have, and she's never been drawn. The ideas in my head of her visual design weren't very strong either, just a girl with brown hair, which as you'll probably seeing at this point isn't the case anymore. Just have a little patience, I'll explain. All I really knew about Iris for sure going into this design was that she was a witch who was abandoned or maybe orphaned at a young age. Previously, the idea behind her was that she was a human who was abandoned for her magical talents or abilities, and then was either raised by mythical creatures or found camaraderie in adulthood among them. But as we just discussed during Roman's segment, I don't want there to be a lot of humans in Nideo Vivus. I just couldn't design a third human for Nideo Vivus in this video, if you're counting Warhook, which I totally am. Before now, I've never had a reason to consider what other species she might be. In addition to that, most of the species for Nideo Vivus aren't super well established yet. Like I said, there's just so many connected parts that it's basically impossible at this point of development to have everything you need already set up to add to. I had to figure out what species Iris should be without even having names for most of them. No species sheets for any of them, and hardly any cultural direction. I got stuck at the beginning for Iris as well, which I think is where the mind mapping technique shines. I decided to first come up with a relevant and more fleshed out backstory for Iris, and hope that the species might reveal itself from that. Since she's usually very talented at magic, even at a very young age, I thought I'd make her the daughter of Magic, the god, from the Chests of Blaze religion I mentioned earlier. I also liked how this connected her to an existing part of Nideo Vivus, instead of just throwing her in. When I was looking at the options of species I have already decided will exist for Nideo Vivus, the snake people jumped out at me as an option. The snake people aren't real. I wasn't quite sold on it for Iris though, until I was doodling in my sketchbook and thought of giving her some sort of cool magic hood. I hadn't thought of the specifics yet, though I thought about maybe some sort of hypnosis, of course inspired by snake charmers, and I thought that moving concentric rings might be an option. I was really sold on the idea of her being a snake actually, but then realized as I was finishing the map that the snake people in Nideo Vivus never raised their young. Iris couldn't be meaningfully abandoned by her parents and wouldn't really need to be raised by someone else if her mortal parent was a snake. This stumped me for a little while, but then I decided that her snake half must come from magic. Just as an aside real quick, I'm realizing that while it's been pretty clear when I'm writing about one of these gods that's named after their specialty versus when I'm referring to the specialty itself, mostly via the power of capitalization, that it doesn't translate as well to speaking about them. I was never really planning for Nideo Vivus to have any sort of strong audio component, but it is something for me to reconsider, especially since this is the second video it's being heavily featured in. Anyway, back to Iris. I already had some vague idea that naiads were good at witchcraft, and that a good chunk of their population followed some tenet of the Chests of Blaze pantheon. Naiads also raise their young, and place a lot of importance on this as well. So I thought that maybe Iris's mother was a naiad who was skilled at witchcraft in her own right, so much so that she caught the attention of Magic. Magic decided to bestow her with a child, who of course turns out to be Iris. She is not very happy that Iris is a snake person though, and also gets scared by just how quickly and naturally Iris picks up witchcraft and magic. I also think that snake people and naiads have some level of rivalry or tension, which I haven't solidified yet, but of course that lends to Iris's story. When Iris is about 5 years old, her mom can't take it anymore and abandons Iris out in the woods. She justifies it to herself that snake people aren't even raised by their parents. Magic is very unhappy with Iris's mother, but I haven't planned exactly the consequences, and Iris's mother isn't really an important part of this video. The first people that Iris comes across after being abandoned are dragons. I have so much to plan regarding dragons in Nideo Vivus, but here's what I know and can tell you now. Dragons are pretty rare, and they're more naturally inclined to chaotic magic than other species are. To avoid making this video even longer, I'll just give a simple distinction for the two magic types I've mentioned. Witchcraft is mostly component based, like potions and spells created by combining various plants and herbs. It's most effective at growth and healing. Chaotic magic pulls energy from a source source and uses it elsewhere, and is most effective at destruction and transformation. Once I knew that Iris is a naiad snake hybrid, it was really easy to finish out the map and actually work on the design. I didn't do it on purpose, but it turns out this was a really good example for the video because I wrote a lot of things on the map that didn't make it into their final design. Plants, moss, flowers, herbs, none of those things really came into play. The reason I say that's a good example is because I think an important part of this mind mapping method is just allowing it to pull you into a direction you like. It's not meant to be a list of steps and must-have elements. Plants and the like were a really good idea and represent Iris well, but they didn't end up in her design because I just didn't like how it looked. You can see for part of the sketching and inking process that I had considered giving her a flower crown, but I liked the sleek silhouette she had more than I liked the flower crown, though I might revisit it for individual pieces. Since I haven't fully planned out any of the species for Nidiovivis, the rules for them are kind of based off of whatever I draw first. For example, the only other snake person I've drawn doesn't have breasts, which was actually kind of a difficult choice for me to make, but I stand by it. Of course, if you're looking at your screen, you'll notice that Iris does have breasts, and I decided to let her be an exception since she is a snake naiad hybrid, and naiads do have breasts and are a little underrepresented in her design anyway. I'm also sure that you've noticed that my snake people don't have a species name yet, since I've said snake people about 100 times during this segment. Naming things is definitely my weakest point in writing. Hell, I made a whole video about creatures from this world, and only 2 of them had species names, and I hadn't even named the world yet. Probably time to start finalizing some of the species. Obviously I want them to have names, but I also want to make species sheets for consistency, and officially write out blurbs about their typical culture, where they live, that sort of thing. It's definitely not my typical content, but I might make a video about that. No promises though. On to my finishing thoughts about the design and process. My immediate takeaway is that I had an idea in my head that I wanted to specifically fight against, and mind mapping made it easier to go in a new direction. I think her design is so cute and unique, without being so loaded with details that she gets lost. Of course, nothing is perfect. My biggest ick with the design sheet is that I'm not very good at drawing water, which, as I've mentioned before, is a me issue and not an issue with the design. There is also an issue with the design, which is that it comes across as very practical, but Iris isn't supposed to be a very practical character. She enjoys whimsy. I honestly think that was a subconscious association with snakes being practical. I think this could have been avoided if I spent more time on the mind mapping part, but I remember being so tired of it and just wanting to draw and get this video done. I think that generally mind mapping won't work as well when you're in a rush, but I also think that applies to most design methods too. Either way, once I had finished Iris, she became my new favorite design. Mind mapping is currently sweeping the podium. Granted, it's only currently competing against designs I made with no technique or goal in mind, but still. When I started working on this video, I wanted to make a video I was really proud of. I didn't want to toss something together at the last minute to fulfill some sort of quota. Perhaps you've heard the adage that every minute of a video takes an hour to edit. I thought that was ridiculous. And then I wanted to make this video really cool and scripted and well put together, and it definitely looks like it's going to take 30 hours for this one. And that doesn't even count the drawing time. The intention of this series is to compare and contrast methods, which is a little hard to do with this being the first one. But I can say with absolute certainty that mind mapping is so much more effective for me than going in without a specific design technique in mind. I think pretty much every issue I had throughout the video would have been fixed by not rushing things, which is related to the issue of recording the process. My biggest piece of advice for drawing is to not record it, or to at least not require yourself to record it, and to avoid timelines, which I know isn't applicable for everyone, and in fact it would be bad advice for myself for most subjects outside of art. Anything that can be objectively done and finished, like a math problem, I do way better with a deadline. But since you can't definitively finish an art piece, I tend to just make a worse drawing, poem, video, etc., which is my main excuse for this video taking so long to get out, in addition to the 30 hours of editing part. Speaking of which, thank you so much for getting to the end of this long video. I hope you learned something and consider trying out the mind mapping method for yourself, since your experience might be totally different than mine. And remember, stay sweet, my honeydews.